Global Lead for Technology and Innovation in Education here at the World Bank. Welcome to this event on the future of education. We're excited to have a number of colleagues and friends who've been kind of working with us on how to think about the future over a number of years. Here at the bank, we make investments trying to project what are going to be the needs of the country 5, 10 years into the future. So the process that we started 10 years ago in the education practice with a project called Evoke was designed to begin to think about what the future might hold. And we partnered with groups like the Institute for the Future and others to begin to model and think about how we should think differently about education. What are some aspects of teaching and learning, of the curriculum that might change over the next 10 years. So we're excited to be here with you today to kind of share a little bit about that journey of how at the World Bank we've been thinking about pushing the frontiers of education, what has happened over the past 10 years, what's happening now with the crisis that we're facing, and what the future might look like 10 years from now. So without further ado, let me pass the baton to our first presenter, our Director for Global Education, Jaime Saavedra, to set a bit of the context. Jaime?
Thank you very much, Bob. And let me start saying that I think we should redefine in a way our concept of what the future is. I mean, as you were saying, you started 10 years ago with this thinking, but already those 10 years have passed. So we are today living those in the 10th year. So are we in the future today already? And so my answer would be probably yes. And second is that we are living the largest imaginable shock to education of the last 100 years. That is, I think, both forcing us on one hand and also opening a window of opportunity to bring many of the things that we were thinking that will be very important in the future, we'll have to bring them to today. So my sense is that this pandemic is forcing us to propel that future that we have been talking about to today. And many of the things that we have been saying during the last years, during those last 10 years that you were mentioning, about how technology could be critical in order to make us move faster in terms of improving learning. I think that's something that we do really need to embrace as tools that will have to be used in a more intensive way today. So my sense is that the future is here already, like it or not, because of the circumstances. And I just want to give a sense of urgency to all this, right? So if we were having this discussion in January, I would have started saying, look, guys, we're living a learning crisis. We really need to move faster. More than half of children in the low and middle income countries reach their 10-year-olds without being able to read and understand a short text, right? So that's what we call this 53% of learning poverty that we have in poor and low income countries and middle income countries. That's already a tragedy, right? That's a huge crisis, right? That means that half of the children have their future being compromised. Now it's worse. Now the baseline from which we're starting is much worse on two fronts. It's much worse because our expectation now is that 53% will shooting up to 63% now because of the consequence of the pandemic, and because despite all the commendable efforts of many countries to do some sort of remote and distance learning, using online, paper, WhatsApp, TV, radio, everything under their disposal, still that has been very far from replacing the presential education. And even when the evidence that starts to trickle down, right, for rich countries, is that the learning losses have been very big. In the rich countries which have had better prepared from a technological perspective, and that have had shorter school closures, right? So if we go to the middle-income countries, to South Asia, or we go to Latin America, right, and to parts of Africa, in which we have very long school closures that have not finished yet, right? We have many countries with 160 or 180 effective days of school then we can think that we can start figuring out that the learning losses are really going to be really big. And in addition to that, we have a huge challenge of inequality, right? Or really an inequality catastrophe, because those learning losses are being extremely different within countries. There are some kids that will have the possibility of connecting by Zoom with their teachers and would have books at home, would have a space to study, right? Can connect with their peers and have some decent engagement. And on the other extreme, in the same country, you will have a kid in the rural area that will have no internet connection at all, and maybe will have to walk a couple of hours in order to get a WhatsApp signal and connect with their teacher. So the experiences that kids are living are extremely different, and the kids who are having a decent experience are really the minority. So we have huge learning losses, and we have a potential inequality catastrophe. So we really need to work much faster. And one of the big lessons is, look, the digital divide was there. We didn't close it. Now we have to close it, right? But it's not only closing the digital divide from the technological perspective. Yes, we need to do that. But at the same time, we'll need to recognize that this is all about balancing technology with the human factor. We have learned also from the pandemic that education is a social experience. Right? So this is all about working better through teachers, through principals, and even through parents, right? Because and definitely we'll need to think of education now in the near future as a continuum between what happens in the school and what happens at home, right? But then that requires worrying about making sure that all the schools have the right conditions in terms of teachers training, in terms of technology, in terms of having the whole ecosystem of hardware, software, the right curriculum, etc., the right teachers training, but at the same time, make sure that we start having better conditions at home. And in terms of connectivity, in terms of parents being able to support better their kids, because we know now, again, because of the pandemic, that we need resilient systems. And resilient systems implies recognizing that the education process is a continuum between what happens in the school and at home. Now, really, technology could be a great ally on all this, right? It's not the solution, but is an extremely important part of this solution. We really were trying to ramp up our work on education technology at the bank. Our rough calculations say, just for you to have a sense of the numbers. Last year, we have additional education financing going through loans and grants to countries of about $5 billion, right? Just this last fiscal year. We calculate at least between 20 and 25% are investments in technology, right? So countries are spending resources in technology, right? And we need to make sure that those resources are well and better spent. And just to close, when we work on the technology front, it's like working on two fronts. One is that we need to help countries do the basics right? To use the right tools, use technology to use effectively tools to teach at the right level. Use technology in order to have better data and know exactly how many teachers they have, what's their professional development, how many students there exist. I mean, there are many basic services, basic issues regarding information on which technology is critical, and we're not using it, and it's not well deployed in many low-income countries. We need to use technology to improve the quality of the teacher's professional development urgently, right? Because we need practical training. We need to work through micro-critical credentials with teachers now, right? So there are many things that is not about pushing the frontier, but it was about using technology to move many countries towards the frontier. But at the same time that we do that, we need to start thinking about the next 10 years, right? Which is what Bob was mentioning. And I see the Evoke initiative, right, as a critical space, right, that we have in order to pilot, test, and continue learning on how can we use technology in a more impactful way, right? And it's extremely interesting on how through this technology we can, for instance, use better tools in order that use game mechanics, that use storytelling, and use social network to develop what we call the 21st century skills, right? To develop the social emotional skills that kids need. At the same time, Evoke, through the use of blockchain, right, is allowing us in real-time test, right, how can we use better information in the design of our projects in order to make sure that, for instance, results-based financing mechanisms really, are applied in real time and create value, which is something that really at this stage is on a pilot basis, right? But that's really something that in the next 10 years is something that could be mainstream. So we have a huge challenge here on technology. On one hand, making sure that more countries do what already we know that can be useful, and at the same time continuing pushing the frontier, which is a bit of what we're going to be talking about today. So really a huge challenge, because it is about working on having the right digital infrastructure, at the same time working on the human infrastructure in order to make sure that all the players in this process have the right digital skills, and at the same time making sure that we have the administrative systems, right, and that will create a whole complete ecosystems that can allow countries to move, effectively and at scale on the digital front. So huge challenge for all of us, and really want to thank everyone that will be part of this discussion that will allow us to reflect a little bit more on how this future that has been propelled to today will look like, and also to understand better how can we use tools like our initiatives, like Evoke, in order to provide better learning opportunities to our kids and young people. So thanks to everyone, and looking forward to a great discussion. Over to you, Bob.
Awesome. Thanks, Jaime. Iñaki is going to cue up a bit of a trailer that's kind of going to tell a story. 10 years ago, when I was in our office in the World Bank in South Africa, I was in discussions with our counterparts in the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Science and Technology that were questioning how to engage young people, how to get them interested in learning, and how to get them interested in solving the problems that we have here in South Africa, in our townships, looking ahead to the Millennium Development Goals, the challenges of water, of food security, of sustainable energy. So I wanted to think where young people spend their time, in-game environments, in graphic novels, on social networks. How can we use where young people spend their time to engage them in both learning and solving some of these grand challenges? And this was kind of the genesis of this project with Evoke. And on the game side, I wanted to reach out to a game designer that was thinking about not just the game aspects, but the storytelling as well, and the opportunities to compel young people to learn and get out into their communities to solve real problems. So I'm very excited that Jane is back with us here today. That's going to help us think about the future, looking back on the past 10 years and to the next 10 years. But we want to kind of share with you a little bit about what we put together 10 years ago in terms of the type of content we could engage young people with. So let's run this trailer first, and then over to Jane. Excellent. So based on these needs in South Africa, I reached out to Jane, and her team came up with this fantastic process of helping young people think about the future. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you, Bob. Let me share my screen so we can get underway. Well, it's so great to be here with you today and with my past and hopefully future collaborators at the World Bank. I'm excited today both to talk to you about the Evoke project and also to teach you how to play a game that has been designed to increase your ability to anticipate and prepare for hard to predict futures, which sounds good, right? Because if there's anything we've seen in the year 2020 so far, it's that we all need to get better at expecting the unexpected. And that is something that I specialize in helping people do. I am the Director of Game Research and Development at the Institute for the Future here in Palo Alto, California. And my job is to invent new tools and social experiences that help people think more systematically, more creatively, and more strategically about how the future might be different, so we can be ready for anything, not be blindsided by surprising events, and also so we can feel more in control of positive transformations that might lie ahead. And the game I'm going to teach you how to play today, 100 Ways Anything Can Be Different in the Future, can help you and communities that you work with do all of that. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about Evoke, which has been on some people's minds lately because Evoke was a game played in 2010, set 10 years in the future, set in the year 2020. And so we are now living in the future that was forecast in that game. And it has kind of turned out to be uncannily accurate in terms of what you were forecasting. For example, you can see here one of the pages from the graphic novel that provided the essentially the textbook for this crash course in social innovation. You can see here it's November 2020. It's in China. They're talking about the first cases of the Pearl River flu, which were detected among migrant workers. One of the major challenges that we asked people in Evoke to think about how they would help solve was a respiratory pandemic, a global outbreak of a respiratory disease that started in China. So we were actually asking our players, what would you do during a pandemic to help your community? And so our players back in 2010 were already learning about terms like social distancing, already thinking about challenges like shortages in personal protective equipment. We were also at the same time talking about potential problems in misinformation and disinformation campaigns. So in a later episode in this 10-week online crash course in social innovation, we talked about what might be happening if there was a flood of misinformation during the pandemic, people spreading misinformation about vaccines, about which regions were safe or not safe to do certain behaviors. We talked about trying to use our tools in our communities to build a better infodemiology system. So already 10 years ago, talking about infodemiology alongside epidemiology and how you might have to fight misinformation at the same time. That was just one of 8 different social crises that we asked our players to think, how would you use your communities, your resources, and your skills and talents to try to solve global crises? Another challenge that we were looking at, you can see here that story was playing out in September of 2020, was historic wildfires in California. And we had a whole episode about how that would impact people's health from breathing the wildfire smoke for extended periods of time, how it would impact economic security. And so it is kind of eerie to have woken up in the real 2020 and be living through exactly these kinds of intersections of crises. And, you know, Bob Hawkins called me and my creative team up and said, can we revisit this? Can you talk a little bit about how you were able to so accurately forecast the future and why were we playing a game set in 2020, 10 years in the future when we were trying to teach people to tackle the urgent challenges of today? So just to touch briefly on why, as a game designer, I almost always set my games 10 years in the future. We do see 10 years as a kind of magic timeline. It's really helpful to work on the 10-year timeline for a couple of reasons. One is 10 years has been shown to be kind of the ideal timeline to help people imagine that things could be different. If you ask people to talk about 1 year, 3 years, or even 5 years in the future, there tends to be a kind of inertia, a feeling of being stuck. We can't change that fast, or, it's just harder for our brains to accept that the pattern might be broken. You send people out 10 years in the future, we see that the regions of the brain that actually are responsible for detecting change and adapting strategies actually becomes more active. And it is, so literally at a neurological level, people are better able to imagine how things could be different through their own actions and efforts 10 years into the future. And from a practical point of view, 10 years is enough time to really make a difference. So just to give you some examples, it took Facebook 10 years to go from its first user to 1 billion users. It took 10 years for the first smartphone to be produced to half of the planet having smartphones. It took 10 years from the first research article written about Bitcoin for it to have a market cap in the multiples of billions. And so 10 years, just from a practical perspective and a technology perspective, is really a long enough lead time for a seed of an idea, for a research breakthrough, for the beginning of a community forming to scale up and have global impact. So if we can start to imagine the kinds of changes we want to make today, 10 years is really long enough to give us the runway to achieve those ways of thinking. Another thing that we do when we try to create scenarios about the future is we follow something called Datters Law to professional futurists. If you were to visit us at the Institute for the Future, you would find Datters Law painted right on our front window. Here's what it says. Any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. And let's just sit with that for a minute. Any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. Now, what does this mean? Why is it important? Well, it's really easy to prepare for futures that are similar to today, to futures that feel familiar, that make sense, that are a continuation of the normal. It's the weird stuff that really catches us off guard, right? It's all of those ideas that make us instinctively say, I just can't even imagine that, or we just dismiss them. That'll never happen. Those are exactly the kinds of ideas that we collectively do need to spend more time and energy taking seriously, because those will be the most disruptive realities if they actually come to pass. And, speaking of ridiculous statements about the future, how would these statements about the future have sounded to all of you, just over a year ago? In the near future, virtually every nation will shut down and lock down its borders to international travel. In the near future, 1 billion students will stop going to school and do all of their learning online or at home or online. In the near future, it will be illegal to hug your grandmother, which is true where I live in California. A year ago, would these statements have seemed ridiculous at first? But you can ask yourself, what could you do if you had had a year or longer to pre-feel the anxiety, pre-experience the stress of these crises, and actually start working creatively, systematically, and strategically to imagine how you might help, or better yet, how you might prepare to avoid these crises. So that's what we were asking players to do in Evoke. And when we came up with the story world for Evoke, we were also following this kind of guideline. We wanted to tell a story about the future that would kind of shock people out of their normal ways of thinking about how things are. And we wanted to kind of flip upside down the normal way of talking about social innovation, particularly as it is talked about with regards to sub-Saharan Africa. So the story that we came up with was about this Evoke network, and the premise was 10 years in the future, sub-Saharan Africa is providing substantial aid, material and strategic, to China, to Europe, to the United States, and to other rich nations. And what we wanted to do with this story is kind of reverse that model of, who provides aid and who provides strategy. So we told this story in which young people who had been working to solve the urgent crises around food insecurity, around economic insecurity, around water access and safety, all of the issues they've been working to solve in their own communities, they were able to use those breakthroughs and their communities of action to jump into action to help the rest of the world as they were dealing with pandemics and food insecurity and other crises. You can see here we were inviting our learners to essentially become members of this Evoke network and to write their origin story. You know, 10 years from now, if you're going to be somebody who is being called upon to provide world-changing, life-saving aid, you know, what were you doing in 2010 to prepare you to be the hero in 2020? And we knew we were onto something when one of our early play testers in South Africa gave us feedback to the story and to the video content. She said, "This is the first time I thought of Africa as a source of the world's biggest solutions and not just the world's biggest problems." And that's a really great example of the game that I'm going to teach you today, the idea behind how we try to help people prepare for change and to be agents of change, which is to try to flip upside down our normal ways of understanding how society works or how problems are experienced today. And so the game we're going to play today, 100 Ways Anything Could Be Different in the Future, is all about flipping the facts of today. And I'm going to teach you how to play, and then we're going to have a chance to start playing it together. So here's how it works. 100 Ways Anything Could Be Different in the Future. The first thing you do is you pick a topic that you want to explore, like the future of food or the future of learning or the future of work. And then you list 100 things that are true about it today. And then you try to imagine a future in which any one of these facts is no longer true. So let's do a quick demonstration together. And for our demonstration, let's use a topic that we all have lots of personal experience with, shoes. Let's say we're trying to forecast the future of shoes. What ridiculous at first ideas could we come up with for this future that might help us anticipate hard to predict events? So after you've picked a topic, our challenge is to list 100 things that are true about that topic today. And for this part of the game, your facts can be generally true in most cases, or generally true for a region that you are particularly active in or invested in. It doesn't have to be true for 100% of people everywhere all the time. So facts that are generally true for the communities or regions that you are most interested in thinking about. So let's start listing some facts about shoes. Facts, shoes aren't free. People buy them for the most part. Fact, most people own more than one pair of shoes, different types of shoes for different occasions. In fact, most people take their shoes off when they go to sleep at night. Now, these are facts for, let's say, for the United States. And you might have different facts for different regions or communities. So that's 3 facts, and you would only need 97 more to go. We're not going to do 100 facts here today since we only have a short time together, but it is good to try to come up with as many as you can, even if you only make it to 50. The more facts you come up with, the better an opportunity for you to identify assumptions that you're working under that you could actually liberate yourself from and discover a new way of thinking about possibilities. Okay, so then comes the fun part. After you've listed your facts, you're going to flip them upside down. So one at a time, you're going to take each fact and you're going to rewrite it so that the opposite is now true, or you will offer a very strange alternative to the reality that you have described. And you can think of this as kind of like creating your own upside down world where everything you think you know is no longer true. So let's try flipping our facts about shoes. 10 years in the future, shoes in the United States are free. Most people only own one pair of shoes. And 10 years in the future, many people sleep with their shoes on. So there we flipped all our facts. Now, during this part of the game, it's important that you don't worry if these facts seem ridiculous at first, if they seem implausible, impossible, they don't make sense. That's actually great. We're trying to generate ridiculous at first ideas. So don't worry about making sense of them yet. Just keep flipping the facts until you have up to 100 alternatives to how things work today. And then comes the challenging part. You know, in the final part of the game, you you pick one or more of these flipped facts and you try to explore them and understand exactly how they work and why that change came to be true. So, why are shoes free now? Or why are people sleeping with their shoes on at night? In this part of the game, you go into these future possibilities as if they were like a virtual reality world. You could already immerse yourself in and visit and explore, look around. How does it work? What would I do here? What's exciting here? What creates anxiety here for me? And this part of the game is the challenging part because, of course, you're trying to make sense of ridiculous at first ideas. And the way you do this is by looking for what futurists call signals of change. Signals of change are real examples of changes that are already underway somewhere in the world. They might be small changes, they might be small experiments or little trends that are just starting to pick up traction. And these signals of change give you a clue as to how over time, if the signals were amplified, if those changes became more commonplace, more widespread, of how the world might be transformed or how a community might be transformed. So you're going to look for real signals of change that might someday, possibly, plausibly explain these strange futures that you've described. So let's talk about the 3 flip facts for shoes that we were exploring. So 10 years from now, why might shoes be free? Well, in many parts of the world, there is a trend towards providing free products or services in exchange for data that the organization can use and monetize. So you can think about platforms like Facebook, which are free, but they get to use and monetize your data. Or how in Singapore, Fitbit gave away free fitness trackers for use in their public health program so that both Fitbit and the government could use that health data. Also, we see a signal where there are increasingly shoes being created that have sensors inside them, so smart shoes that can track things like your weight and your gait, your physical activity, your location. There are shoes that can detect fatigue based on how your balance or your body posture changes, which is important for, working places, dangerous places like factories. Shoes that can also detect your social proximity. Who have you been standing near? Who have you walked by? So maybe in the future, we could imagine that health companies or governments are giving away smart shoes for free in exchange for the data that they provide. I think this seems like a plausible future, especially as we're heading into a post-pandemic world where we are experimenting with new surveillance technologies that might allow us to prevent or control future outbreaks. So that's one flip fact. How about our next one? 10 years from now, why would most people only own one pair of shoes? Perhaps over the next decade, we'll see a significant downward shift in economic consumption in some parts of the world, whether due to economic realities, are we heading into a global depression after the COVID-19 outbreak? Or maybe as a part of our commitment to climate action. So in this past year, we did see a trend out of Sweden called flight shaming, where people were shamed out of taking unnecessary air travel due to the high carbon impacts. So maybe over the next decade, this flight shaming will start to pick up cultural momentum and people will be shamed for consuming too much of any consumer good. And it might be a kind of sign of your commitment to climate action to only own one pair of shoes that you wear everywhere. And if you are, owning too much stuff, you are shoe shamed. Also, just looking around for other signals of change. This was a couple of Twitter posts that I found this spring when I personally embarked on my investigation of the future of shoes. And these speak to another possible explanation for why we might only own one pair of shoes in the future. You can see these tweets from the spring. The first one says simply, remember shoes, because of course, as we started with our stay-at-home orders, we weren't going out as much. We were not needing all of just the stuff we had acquired. This other tweet says things that don't matter right now, clothes, shoes, watches, jewelry, cars. What's the new status symbol during a lockdown? And this tweet had, as you can see, more than 2,000 different replies. And this is a fascinating thread of suggestions about what people will really value in the future that might change, what our economies are powered by or based on. And I would not have found this incredible wealth of information about people's changing needs and desires if I had not already been playing 100 ways anything could be different in the future of shoes. But that's one of the most powerful things about this game or about games like Evoke. When you're playing games that are about the future, you suddenly start to see signals of change everywhere. Your radar is just up and you discover these signals even if you only played a game for 15 or 20 minutes like we are today, you suddenly start to see and collect these signals of change. All right, so let's talk about the last flip fact. 10 years from now, why would many people sleep with their shoes on? Well, I personally lived through an experience this year and last year that could provide an explanation for this flipped future. Here in California, I was advised by a Red Cross evacuation and rescue expert during our wildfire, our high warnings and evacuation warnings to sleep with either with my shoes right next to my bed or to sleep with my shoes on, because it turns out many people lose precious time trying to escape a quickly moving fire, looking for their shoes, or they injure themselves in bare feet. And that's actually a main source of injury during evacuations, is if you didn't have your shoes on. So my family started sleeping with our shoes on. For those of us in California and other regions that had a lot of wildfire outbreaks this year, such as Australia, this was a traumatizing experience to go through. Even if you didn't lose a family member or lose your home, there was a growing sense of dread and anxiety about what might happen. So maybe in the future, in parts of the world that are impacted by the climate crisis, in parts of the world that are experiencing more extreme weather, whether it's flooding, extreme heat, wildfires, extreme storms, maybe some of us start to live with a kind of climate-related post-traumatic stress disorder. And one symptom of that trauma, that PTSD response, is that we always sleep with our shoes on, just in case. Now, this is just one small detail of one possible future, but it helps us start a conversation now about the real long-term psychological consequences of the crises we're already living through today, not just in the future. So that's how you play this game. You pick a topic, you list 100 things that are true about it today, and then you try to imagine a future in which any of these facts is no longer true, how or why. And I just wanted to bring this game to you today because I found this incredibly powerful in communities for people of all ages. And I hope that it's a tool that you can use in your own work. And just to give you even a little more firsthand experience of it, we're just going to take a few minutes now to start playing on the future of learning. And here's one pro tip. When I play this game, I often invite people to collect some of what we call driving forces, which are any significant trend or phenomenon that might be shaping how our future turns out. Driving forces can't predict the future exactly, but they tell us what direction change is currently headed, and if we stay on that path, how it's likely to unfold, or they give us a sense of, some of the boosters of change, some of the technologies that are accelerating change, some of the new regulations or policies or social movements that are accelerating change that are likely to affect where we end up. This is a list of driving forces that at the Institute for the Future we bring to bear on almost any forecasting project we're working on, whether it's the future of professional sports or the future of currencies, whatever we're thinking about. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is just to take a look at this list here, and would you add to chat the 2 or 3 of these driving forces that you feel are most likely to affect the future of learning in your communities or your regions where you're working. So our list of driving forces include climate change, the current pandemic and post-pandemic trauma, increasing economic inequality, automation of work, increase in facial recognition and surveillance technologies, new data regulatory efforts and privacy efforts, virtual reality accessibility and uptake, the shift to clean energy, blockchain and cryptocurrencies, the Internet of Things, computational propaganda, misinformation, bots and deepfakes, smart cities infrastructure, decreasing birth rates in some parts of the world, youth boom in other regions, the rise of esports, homeschooling and unschooling shifts, the need for lifelong learning and reskilling in today's kind of volatile workforce, and an increasing interest in universal basic income as a backbone for society. So hopefully we can take a look in chat here and see some of, I see climate change, automation of work coming in. Automation of work has appeared quite a few times. Increasing economic inequality and lifelong learning. Great. Oh, smart cities. Very interesting. Also, this is very beneficial for me as a researcher to see what you're choosing as well. Climate change, homeschooling, unschooling. Okay, great. So as it's kind of leading into it, we're looking at our driving forces. Now let's just try to take a quick stab at 100 ways learning could be different in the future. So let's start listing up to 100 things that are true about learning today. I think we have 3 minutes left, and so let's just take a couple minutes to add some facts to the chat now. What is true about learning today? And there's no fact that's too obvious or too simple. You know, for example, I might say that, you know, that the goal of school is to graduate. And you might be able to flip that fact to say in the future, no one ever graduates from school, ever, anywhere. So we see some good facts coming in. Students learning a building, learning happens in a school. Let's see what else we have coming in here. Students are organized by grades. Teachers teach students. Oh, I love that one. That would be a fun one to flip, right? A world in which students teach the teachers. There's only one way to succeed at school. There's a curriculum, right? What does school, world without curriculum look like? Student debt at all levels. Teachers are the backbone. Teachers teach a subject, right? What would that look like to flip that fact? Great. So as we're adding all of our facts here, teachers are alone in a classroom. I could flip that fact for you, Bob. I would flip it to, you know, every teacher has 3 companion AI that they teach with, for example. Very interested in the future. You learn math. All right. How would you flip that fact if math learns you? I wonder what that would look like. Great. So as we're collecting these facts, why don't we start flipping them? Can you find one or more facts in this thread, in this chat, and start flipping them to be the opposite? Right. AI is math and teaches you. Thank you. That's a great flip. Students get paid to complete exams. I love that. Every student has 30 mentor teachers. Yes, that's a great one. When we were creating Evoke, we were imagining how we might flip the future of the student-teacher ratio, and we imagined an online course in which instead of having 30 students for every teacher, we might have 30 teachers for every student. And of course, the way we decided to approach that was through peer review and peer evaluation, and by inviting lots of mentors to participate in the network as well. I would like to point out we were the first massively open online course to really pioneer peer review with over 10,000 concurrent students. So congratulations to the World Bank and the team that created that technology and made that possible. All right. Well, I think our time is running short, but I do want to invite you to continue thinking about how you might flip these facts and continue looking through the chat. If you know, as we have the rest of our time together this day today, if a flip fact pops in your mind, go ahead and add it to the chat. And then just, you know, keep thinking about it this week. Go out and collect some signals of change that could help describe the role of 2030. These are exactly the techniques that we use, looking for those signals of change, looking for the driving forces, and trying to flip the facts of today. That's exactly the techniques we used to create the original Evoke and to create that forecast that was so uncannily accurate, but also hopefully that inspired many of our 10,000 learners to prepare and be ready and to be able to lean into the challenges we're facing in 2020 with a more sense of confidence and agency and optimism. Thank you very much for the time today to play this game with you and to talk to you about Evoke. And I will hand it back to Bob, I think.
Awesome. Fantastic, Jane. That was inspiring. So if I can get the ball back, Iñaki, I will share a little bit of the ridiculousness and weird stuff that we have been doing for the last 10 years, some of the lessons learned, and some of the driving forces that we're trying to leverage through this process. Let me go ahead and share my screen. In the meantime, the next panel after my presentation, I'll be brief, 10 to 15 minutes. We'll kind of build on this exercise that Jane has started around what the future will hold. And we have a number of panelists from the government of Turkey, from the U.S. Treasury, from the Gates Foundation, moderated by my colleague Prima, that will begin to kind of tease out what this future of education might be in 10 years. But let me go ahead and share my screen here and share with you all what we have been up to and what were some of the major lessons learned from these past 10 years, and in particular, what happened in this last iteration of Evoke. So again, as Jane explained, this is an online game where we engage young people in thinking about global grand challenges and along the way develop 21st century skills through the use of game mechanics. In this last iteration that I'll share with you today, we included the idea of a cryptocurrency as one of the key game mechanics. One of the mechanics in the game is students do activities, earn points. They use those points to go to the marketplace to purchase goods and services. What if you could convert those points into actual value? So that was the challenge that we faced in this last iteration that I'll talk to you about. And also, if you were able to define exactly what students needed to do, the results, to earn those points, how could you then incentivize external partners to fund those students to be able to identify results up front and be able to trace the funds that are put into a cohort of students down to the last dollar, down to the last student. So these were two assumptions that we were trying to play with in this exercise. A little bit on the history of Evoke. Any innovation is iterative. As we said, we started 10 years ago, but we kept pushing the envelope and kind of looking for these driving forces and these signals of change. So we talked about the first iteration in South Africa. We followed up with the Ministry of Science and Technology in Brazil, looking at ways in which we could kind of expand the type of global grand challenges that we could introduce in a different language at the secondary school level. In the third iteration, we brought two countries together to look at themes of food security, energy, and water. In the fourth iteration, we went deep into this issue of 21st century skills. What role can technology play in defining what these skills are, operationalizing them in a curriculum, assessing them, and evaluating them? In the fifth iteration, we partnered with World Vision and looked at whether Evoke could be used for out-of-school youth, the extent to which students that were not in school could come to a youth center to learn these skills as well. In the latest iteration, we partnered with Consensus and our own internal innovation lab to begin to test this idea of the blockchain, and we actually then implemented it in Colombia this past year amidst the pandemic. Again, Jane talked about the issue of engaging young people in global grand challenges and how this has played out from 10 years ago to today. I won't kind of reiterate the two challenges around wildfires and the global pandemic that were kind of predicted and were used to prepare students to think about how they would solve these challenges 10 years in the future. And I think 10 of the lessons that I want to share with you over the years are one, this sense of purpose. And I think we see this more now than ever as students are learning online, that it's critical that students have a sense of purpose, that their learning means something, that what they're doing is contributing to a global societal change, but also change in their communities. That there's engaging content. Again, the idea of what if curriculum was like a great movie, like the trailer we showed. The third lesson was the real importance of social capital, that many of our young people are isolated, have low expectations, have limited access to social capital. How can technology bring additional social capital, additional ideas, support structures, this idea of flipping from one teacher to 30 students to bringing 30 teachers and mentors to every student in the world. This idea of game mechanics we're seeing today, the need for feedback and continuous feedback, the formative assessments that are so important to help students learn, and the issues around failure, that it's important that you can fail in a game environment, learn, and do better the next time. The link between project-based learning and 21st century skills. I think this is a real big challenge. There are pockets of innovation around the world that are looking at project-based learning, but overall, the curriculum is fairly rigid and fairly inflexible, although there are countries such as Finland and others that are looking at ways in which to open up the curriculum and look more deeply at 21st century skills. We also find that the teaching of 21st century skills is best done in a project-based learning environment. This idea of relevant skills, how do you define these 21st? These are hard to measure skills, hard to define skills. What is creativity? What is empathy? And again, when you put it into a project-based learning environment where you're empathetic with the people in your community that are displaced, or empathetic with the challenges of poor water in your community, you begin to kind of understand empathy than just learning it in a vacuum. Also, in terms of creativity, when you're problem solving with a group of students, you're going to develop creativity more effectively than in isolation. This also leads into the issue of micro-credentials. How can you use technology to better target and assess and measure student learning? And this is part of what we get at in this last iteration in Colombia of using the blockchain to define student results up front and clearly in the learning process. What Jane talked about, innovation is inexhaustive, that there are sources of innovation in our teachers, in our students that are vastly untapped, and there are great opportunities to tap into those sources of innovation. The issue of global citizenship, that students around the world, teachers as well, want to be part of global thinking, want to be part of solving some of the social development challenges that we face. And the importance of this kind of global local and global dynamic is essential. And then finally, what we'll talk about here is kind of the lessons learned from this last iteration on how blockchain can kind of empower youth and provide transparency for bringing additional financing to education. These are just, I'm just going to share some examples of kind of how some of these lessons have played out in terms of using social networking in the context of a learning platform to engage students through different mechanics. Again, the game mechanics is a way to engage students. This last one around Evoke coins and marketplace is where we've kind of translated these game mechanics into a cryptocurrency. This is talking about the kind of a social innovation cycle and a project-based learning cycle where you kind of engage students in thinking about the challenge in a local context, that they develop their own ideas and understand the problems, that they're able to kind of develop a prototype that works in the real world, and then communicate their idea. So this process of project-based learning and how you structure it is important. These are some of the skills that we've been playing with. We've kind of gamified the language a bit, but there are 4 broad constructs from problem solving to empathy to collaboration and communication to creativity. And under each of these constructs, we've defined specific skills, and under each skill, we define specific definitions. And then we build up from there by developing tasks that respond to these skills. Now, let me delve into kind of the launch of this latest iteration on kind of applying Evoke in Colombia using blockchain technology. And again, the problem that we're trying to solve, we talked about. The challenges with unmotivated youth, particularly now when students are losing some of that social engagement face-to-face. How do you create that social engagement online? The issue of relevant skills and how we think about developing some of these skills around critical thinking, collaboration, communication. This issue around unrealized youth potential, that there are sources of innovation and potential for youth to learn and affect change in their communities. We're also addressing issues of transparency. As the World Bank, in our disbursements, we want to make sure that disbursements that we make, that governments make, particularly when they go to the school level, are completely transparent and they reach the end users. And then finally, the issue of high monitoring evaluation costs. That we do in the bank a lot of results-based financing. So we finance outcomes or results as opposed to inputs. But for every dollar we spend on those projects, there's another 50 cents that we spend on verification of those results. So the question is, how can we use technology more smartly to be able to reduce those costs and embed the assessment into the learning process itself? So again, these were kind of some of the challenges that we were addressing when we developed the project. Again, these three goals at the bottom here are to evaluate the impact on transparency and trackability of funds, student motivation, and then cost savings in results-based financing. So again, we feel that blockchain and crypto tokens are unique in this way. I won't go into too much depth on this, but I want to show you the model of kind of how this actually worked in practice. So imagine resources in dollars or pesos come into our trust fund. What we do is then we convert that dollar into a digital representation of that peso or that dollar on the blockchain. That money as a cryptocurrency can then be given to a donor to determine kind of what of a number of projects they want to invest in. These projects are then developed by cohorts of students. So you'll have a cohort of students in Colombia that might be defined as $1,000. A donor will kind of transfer money into that cohort in the form of a cryptocurrency, and that will be linked to that set of students with very clear rules for what those students need to do to release those resources. And what we did in this case was that the resources were released and then used in a closed marketplace for purchasing cell phone minutes. We then defined kind of what are the rules, and in this case, we made it very simple. Students had to complete activities and complete them with quality, which is defined by getting 80% or better as evaluated by their teachers. You can include teachers in this formula as well. To simplify this process, we actually took them out of it. The students would then go to the marketplace, expend the tokens that they earned, and all of this would be completely transparent on a donor dashboard where each transaction would be timestamped and linked to the individual user who ultimately received and used the resources. So this was the basic scheme of what we wanted to put together. I want to highlight also that because this is cutting-edge technology, there are a number of legal and regulatory challenges that we faced. And one of the innovations within the bank that we're able to work out with our legal team was developing kind of a safe space, a legal sandbox, where we defined all of the risks and challenges upfront and then designed the intervention to account for these challenges. So issues around kind of how we deal with open source technology, how we develop stable coins, how we actually distribute tokens, how we think about smart contracts, which are basically the if-then statements. If a student completes an activity, then X number of tokens are dispersed. How we think about privacy issues with that. The limitations and restrictions on data use. Whether to use public blockchains or private blockchains. So these were all a number of issues that we worked through. The results of this activity were very promising. This was a very short project. We started last September, and we finished in June of this year. And we implemented during the pandemic. We worked with partners in Colombia and one university in Colombia with about 250 students that were engaged in this. So some of the high-level results are on student motivation. The teams completed 85% of the content, which for any online course is extremely impressive. The second point is that the content supported 21st century skills, that 85% of the total number of students scored a 10 out of 10 on the questions related to the graphic novel. So the engagement with storytelling was a key element for the students in terms of thinking about the content and learning. The project also recognized student skills and awarded overall a number of 2,089 badges. So these were micro-accreditations for when students developed the individual skills that I highlighted, as well as the construct of skills on empathy, creativity, communication, and problem solving. The second question that we asked was around the transparency and traceability of funds. So again, we did a lot of work on kind of defining what are the rules for disbursement of these tokens. What were the incentives that we should build into these rules for students? And again, for this round, we made it very simple, but there are many more interesting ways in which to construct these rules using this technology. We created the donor dashboard to provide full transparency and got feedback from a number of the donors that we worked with, including the Prosperidad Social in Colombia, as well as Telefónica, which was a fantastic partner who both provided the cell phone minutes that the users would use to redeem their tokens. And then finally, the issue around kind of efficiency for results-based financing. And this is a different type of results-based financing because what we tried to do is get down to the classroom level, to the student level, which is normally very difficult to do. So we had a number of discussions with different government partners on kind of the opportunities to kind of leverage this program for validation and verification of the learning that took place in this project. Let me wind up here with just some final thoughts. One, that thank you to the Disruptive Technology for Development program. This is really important in the bank, that we kind of push the boundaries of new technologies, take risks, kind of identify these signals of change, do the ridiculous and weird stuff to kind of understand what might be potential areas of growth, particularly in education for the future for our clients. This sandbox approach that I talked about was really important for creating space to do these types of innovations. Having a flexible and open platform was really critical to be able to adjust on the fly, because there were many adjustments during the pandemic where the students were going to be working online, but then going out to their communities as well as meeting face-to-face. Everything was then virtual, and the engagement with the community was structured in a virtual way. The way in which we created innovation networks, both within Colombia as well as with partners outside of Colombia. For instance, this initiative was around sustainable cities, in which we brought in the city of Vitoria to kind of share what they were doing. There are a number of lessons on the blockchain that we want to build on. We'll be putting together a community of practice, initiating a meeting tomorrow, and then having a series of activities in the coming year that will kind of build on a number of these lessons. How do you use technology for decentralized procurement? How do you work with our trust fund department to bring the use of blockchain for transparency and traceability, which is work that is already started? How do you crowd in other development partners? How do you create better frameworks and smart contracts? And ultimately, how do you kind of support and build networks of value exchange in countries? And this is something we want to continue to deepen in Colombia. And just a final point on kind of these results-based rules. They were very simple, but the key issue here is, how do you know that quality learning is happening, and how can you guarantee that there's trust in the system? And I think with blockchain technology and some of the game theory involved in blockchain technology, there are ways in which to incentivize the truthful and accurate reflection of the types of learning and assessment that is necessary to determine whether learning is actually taking place. So let me stop there. Again, thank you very much for your interest and time. We have a paper that we very detailed on our site. We'll be sharing this presentation and others, as well as a more concise executive summary next week, and we'll share with you the link. So let me stop there. And I want to now move to kind of our next segment here, which is going to be looking at how different partners think about the future and the future of education. And I'd like to turn over to my colleague Prima and introduce our panelists and let them introduce themselves as well. We have Hakan Bey from the Ministry of Education in Turkey, who's working on a very interesting project that the bank is supporting on developing hybrid learning for the system in Turkey. We have a colleague, Asya, from the Gates Foundation, that is working with us on foundational learning and ways technology can support some of the learning poverty issues that Jaime emphasized at the start. And then we have Brian, who is working with the Department of Treasury and is thinking about ways in which countries can more effectively use this technology to crowd in financing. And financing is a huge issue that all education systems are facing, particularly in this pandemic and all of the different needs in the public sector. So with that, let me pass over to Prima to set the stage for this discussion with Asya, Hakan Bey, and Brian. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. I wanted to thank all the speakers who came in ahead to have held the audience attention so well. I think the feedback was very, very encouraging. My name is Prema. I work with the Technology and Innovation Lab here at the World Bank, and I've been privileged to be a part of the Evoke project, since 2018. A lot of learnings along the way, and it is really exciting to actually see and discuss what the future of such a project actually looks like, especially since COVID has suddenly brought, what technology and education need to do to absolute to the fore. I am really looking forward to a very engaging conversation with Brian, Asya, and Hakan. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to very quickly, we can have this as a, I have a couple of questions, and maybe you can just take turns answering them based on, whoever is more comfortable or with whom the question resonates more. So I think I was just looking at some of the responses from the audience on what education would look like in 2030. I'm just going to probably, highlight some of the very, very cool ones. I like this one that said, teachers are like Uber. You pick the one closest to you and the one with the highest rating. That was so different. Someone else said in 2030, skills are quantified like real assets and become a new currency where anyone with an internet connection can learn, prove their skills, and earn a living wage. And also, education is probably going to be centered more around socioeconomic skills and the ability to look at self and change management and the possibility to work in changing contexts. So I'm kind of just cherry picking some of these really interesting ones. And here's what I want to ask, the three of you. Now, the audience has been giving us their vision of what education looks like in 2030. Which ones actually resonate with you and also align with Datters Law of being ridiculous today? And that's something that I really look forward to hearing from you all.
Prima, I'm happy to start if that's useful.
Absolutely, Brian. I really look forward.
So I think where I would pick up on is that there is this notion that you raised a second ago about incentivizing the development of the most valuable skills and helping people get the education that migrates them to the most valuable skills. What I would say is this, okay, and that is employment markets already do a pretty good job of creating price signals to induce people to take the highest paying jobs that their skills allow them to achieve. The problem with that is that there are values to education in an economy that are not fully captured by employment markets. And so Bob and I have talked about this before in connection with my concept of country coin, which has been written about just in the last couple of days. The idea of country coin is basically markets through employment will deliver the kinds of incentives you're talking about. And yet economies grow even among people who are getting more educated but who aren't succeeding in the employment market. And that's because people who are more literate and more numerate are better consumers. They tend to be better citizens. They tend to vote more often. They tend to be less violent. Crime rates are lower, et cetera, even among people who are educated who didn't get the high-paying jobs. So if you think about the way that employment markets price discriminate, it tends to be that like the engineers make more money than the teachers, and the teachers make more money than the janitors. And that may be okay. That's what the market seems to value. And yet, even if you're a person who went to college in a lower paid profession, let's say you're a philosophy student versus an engineering student, the fact of your higher education is still benefiting the economy. And so one of the points of the country coin concept, which I just throw out here for the general discussion, is the idea that we ought to be able to tokenize national economies in such a way that everybody who achieves educational advancement, okay, benefits from the GDP growth of a higher education separately from the extra advantage that people who took the highly skilled professional route get, right? So there are two components, in other words, to everybody's compensation. One is the mere fact of advancing your education gets a certain level of universal compensation. And then your success in the employment market is what differentiates the value of your specific skills relative to somebody else. Some people would call this universal basic income, but it's also been called universal basic instruction, where the idea is that as a year of education increases in a society, that society's GDP grows on a fairly predictable level. And so I just want to put out there the distinction between a universal value of an additional year of education in a country versus the differential value that employment markets capture today.
Oh, that is such an interesting concept because it almost turns around a lot of the economic concepts that revolve around education, literacy, and jobs. So that is a very interesting approach. I just want to hold that thought and probably ask Asiya and Hakan what they think are probably going to be the most, interesting aspects of education that they foresee in 2030. Asiya and Hakan can.
Hi.
Yeah. Please, you can continue, Asiya.
Thank you, Hakan. Something Brian said about the year of school, and we know the impact of dogs in terms of health and family, etc. But what is the focus on year of learning and what impact that has? So the learning poverty indicator, 53% learning poor, in South Africa, 87% learning poor. And to think about what will really shift that. So great session and brilliant to hear for our ideas. But one of the things that I wanted to pick a little bit up on was something that Bob was talking about in the 10 lessons for the 10 years on the micro-credentials. And thinking not necessarily about micro-credentials for the students in terms of assessment and measurement, but actually micro-credentials for teaching. And that was also the concept of the teacher teaching a subject. And this is, by the way, reacting back to what we're hearing today as opposed to our global education strategy, so just want to clarify that. But if we, teaching is such a big concept, and if we broke that down into little segments and had those conventionalized, and when we relate it back to what the session made me think about is when I was teaching, I used to be a secondary school math teacher. I joined the school where the results were 10%, and we decided that each teacher would specialize in a particular topic. So it was fractions, or it was algebra, etc. And then the teacher rotated teaching their subject. So I'm fascinated by the idea of what if we micro-credentialize aspects of teaching and got specialists to do that.
Thank you, Asiya. I think that was a very interesting concept. I think micro-credentialing of teachers is not as common today, but I think it sets the stage for thinking around a new line of experimentation. I just saw an audience feedback, Asiya, that your audio quality may not necessarily be very audible. So in case you just want to fix that before we come back for the next round of questions. Thank you. Thank you so much. Hakan, can I please ask you to give us your vision of what education looks like in 2030?
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I need to say that it was a great presentation just before the meeting, and I benefited from it very much. But we need to think about engagement firstly, because from my personal point of view, engagement will be the key concept in the future. It was a key concept in the past. It is now really important. But we need to transform the level of engagement. Let's say engagement 1.0 at past, engagement 2.0 now, and we are going to talk about engagement 3.0 for future, for the next 10 years. Because, and another part is engagement will not be a concept, a notion for the students. We as a teaching professional, or as the education professionals, we see engagement as a concept for students, but we are going to see engagement for teachers profession. We are going to see engagement for NGOs. We are going to see engagement for ministry. So the pandemic taught us that all the stakeholders should be engaged to cope with educational challenges. So in the next 10 years, we are going to discuss the engagement 3.0 for all the stakeholders, all the education community. This is the critical part from my point of view. On the other hand, we are going to start to discuss the tools, how to engage all the stakeholders, how to engage students in learning and teaching processes. We are going to focus on this after determining the engagement level or new engagement models. There are going to be new tools for all the stakeholders. So the key concept will be discussing all the stakeholders and creating networks for all these stakeholders and connecting all networks into ecosystems will be the main part of discussion for the next 10 years from my point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hakan. I think between Brian, Asya, and you, we have covered an entire range of where we think 2030 needs to be looking at. So there is the ecosystem level, there is the, teacher teaching micro-credential level, and there is also the stakeholder engagement, including the students level. So I think this probably sets the stage for getting our next question back to today, where we're seeing that COVID has actually exposed many digital divides. I remember Jaime mentioning that, we have these many 180 school days almost that we have missed out. So now we also see divides around infrastructure, skills, social capital. And here's the question that I want to ask all of the three of you. Do you think technology is playing the role of an enabler or a divisive force? What should be the ideal interventions, legally, politically, infrastructure-wise, technologically, et al., to actually make this a public good? And, in case you have any other ideas, it would be amazing for actually us as the audience to learn from your experience thus far.
So Prima, again, I'm happy to sort of launch in here just with a couple of quick thoughts. I would say that at a superficial level, technology is both an enabler and also a divider. In the world of the pandemic, of course, it allowed children to maintain some minimal connection to an education environment for those who had available technology. Of course, it further widened the gap among kids who didn't have the technology. But again, there's an underlying assumption here that I would just challenge for a moment, and that is, at least in the West, we have a cultural assumption that education is a thing that we pay for. So, a university education in the United States costs about $75,000 a year that you have to pay for to avail yourself of that benefit. Private school education costs $50,000 a year that you have to pay for. And the associated technology to do the work is something, again, that you have to pay for. What I'm trying to do is make the case that, in fact, education is a classic public good, the value of which is not fully captured by the people who are delivering the public good, in this case, the students. And if we understood that society benefits from more people getting educated, and it benefits in measurable ways, again, the increase in the relative education level of 1 year, if a country goes from a 6th grade education level to a 7th grade education level, on average, that society is going to experience an increase in GDP of almost 1 percentage point, which is tens of billions of dollars in a given middle income country. And so the question I have is, why do we frame this in terms of we have to pay for the technology and we have to pay for the education? The beauty of Evoke and Country Coin and similar kinds of solutions is the insight that if we allowed a mechanism for people getting educated to get paid instead of paying for it, this problem would solve itself. So if you knew, for example, that by getting an education, you were definitively going to make money because you were getting your share of the national growth that was occurring, it'd be no problem to go and buy a computer. The reason it's a problem to go and buy an iPad or a computer to take your education is right now you have no certainty that the education you're taking will in fact deliver economic benefits to you. So helping the students capture the public good that they are creating will allow them the money to fund all of these things that currently is causing the digital divide. I think that is the solution, is to turn the assumption on its head.
Brian, I find that very interesting because, it's not just education, but education and jobs are actually linked. So if I don't see myself having an employable future, my need for actually subscribing to, qualitative education is probably going to be diminished. So I think that's a very interesting perspective that you bring in. And I probably want to see what, Hakan and Asya also have to say. Asya, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me? Is that better now?
Yeah.
Yes, I can. This is a little better. Thank you so much.
No problem. I think where the education in the foundation is focused on is improving foundational literacy and numeracy. Without the skills, accessing technology and making use of it becomes more challenging. So the pandemic has shown us the importance of schools as more than just places of learning, but as part of the social fabric of society. But also the role of technology in being an enabler, of course, it was familiar with the wider aspect of the lack of connectivity, power, and the hardware. But while there are people working on that and governments are thinking about it and highlighting the need for technology and education technology, we've also got to think about what it is that connectivity will do. So that intersection between pedagogy, is this the right technology to use? So what we know about the learning sciences and sciences of teaching, the integration of that with the process technology, and then with the system, and with the system training that teachers and teachers being supported to use that technology, as well as parents understanding the role of technology in supporting learning is really important. So we need to think about what is the quality of the solutions that will enable learning, as well as the infrastructure and the hardware aspect that will enable that technology to be reaching those underserved and balancing the wider.
Thank you so much, Asiya. I think my mother is a teacher, and I think she would probably resonate with everything that you said, because if education doesn't reach that last mile, then, Brian's concept of looking at, every, with every percentage point improvement in education, we're actually looking at improved GDP. So you actually see the micro-macro link playing out very beautifully here. I think Turkey is probably, and I'm looking at, based on what, Bob also told me, I think, Hakan, Turkey is embarking on a very interesting process here as well to kind of build that ecosystem of innovation. What is your actual take on how technology can play more of an enabler role here than a divisive one? What do you foresee in terms of, very concrete actions that are happening right now in Turkey?
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, we have been working on digitalization of Turkish education system for more than 10 years. We have installed more than 450 interactive boards to our classrooms, and all the classrooms are connected to broadband internet connection. However, after the pandemic, we were somehow ready for the pandemic. We had our national education information center for the students, and we transformed on or strengthened the infrastructure of this network. So nowadays we have a newly started World Bank project, a big project, large-scale project, and we intend to increase the number of concurrent users to 5 million in 3 years' time. So it will address the needs of Turkish students to have personalized digital content, which will address, which will help us to reduce the gap, reduce the digital gap or skill gap for the students. On the other hand, we are going to start a new ecosystem. And as I said, just in my last speech, the important thing is to combine, is to harmonize all the stakeholders for education. The pandemic taught us this lesson. So the education issue is not only the responsibility of the teachers or the Ministry of Education. We need NGOs, we need private sector, we need other stakeholders. So we are going to mobilize all those stakeholders into one educational technology ecosystem, and we are going to have an open, complex network for all those stakeholders, and the grassroots innovation will be supported by the ministry, and the teachers will be able to disseminate or level up or scale up their innovation to the country level. So if we are going to mobilize the teachers, we are going to mobilize the private sectors, we are going to mobilize the startups and cluster all of them for the common good, for the new innovations for the education system. And really, we are really excited for this nowadays. We are working on the change management of this ecosystem, and we believe that the change is not a concept that can be managed. We believe that it should be led. So the ministry has its own role and transforming its role to a leading role. So this is a main paradigm shift we are planning today for the near future.
so much, Hakan. I think it is very interesting to actually sit back and see how you're creating an ecosystem out here that is complex, that is interdependent. And I absolutely agree with you that education is not the responsibility of just a small fragment of society. If I link what the three of you said, education is basically changing and impacting the fortunes of how a country moves across economic segments. And I think from that perspective, education now is probably very important. And I think what technology brings to education is also probably going to change the face of what education was actually imagined to be. I think in the interest of time, there's just time for one more question. And this is what I wanted to ask all of you. Right now, less than 3% of global spend is actually allocated to digital spend in education. And it is a severe hindrance because the scale of things to come are probably going to be very technocentric. Here, education is starved of capital compared to other sectors. Hakan, you were talking about, mobilizing private sector. Arsia was talking about micro-credentialing of teachers. Brian had a great concept around country coin, where, you have a flywheel effect to bring education and equity together. So what are the new, in your words or in your vision, what are the new partnerships necessary to drive and crowd in resources and support more innovation here? And, open to the three of you again. Maybe if,
and maybe I can just jump in to keep
sure.
Maybe some comments short, and we'll kind of wrap up this as we're getting close to the end of the segment. But back to you, Prima.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Well, if I could just jump in, I'll give you my 10 or 15-second answer, which is it's all about alignment of incentives. If we think about it in terms of we're spending 3% of GDP on education and we should be spending 5%, what that means is we'll have to take money from some other program to devote to education, and that quixotic quest has never been successful politically. But I think what can be successful politically is if we focus on the idea that education produces growth, and it's about sharing a portion of the growth attributable to education, then it's less of a zero-sum scenario and we can align incentives. So that would be my answer.
That game theory perspective, Brian, very interesting.
The importance of the teachers and parents being part of this conversation on how technology can solve it. Obviously, the developers, the cognitive scientists, etc., all working with government to make sure that technology has a meaningful impact on learning.
And from my point of view, teachers are the integral part of this change, and they should be included actively in all the changing processes. Also, the families are really vital for this process. I agree with Aisha for this.
Thank you so much. I think between the three of you, we have touched upon some very macro perspectives, legal, regulatory, political, system, stakeholder. And I personally am very encouraged and interested in seeing what the future of education in 2030 looks like. Bob, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to such an interesting panel, and back to you again.
No, this was fantastic. Thanks, Brian, Hakan Bey, Asia, Prima. It was a fantastic discussion. I'm just going to wrap up here very quickly. First of all, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Jane for an inspiring talk about the future. As you can see, there are lots of possibilities for the future, and I think we have to grab them. Engaging our youth, skilling teachers, defining what the skills are. How do you measure skills? How do you deal with micro-credentials? How do you think about the ecosystem? How you crowd in financing and create the incentives for that financing to education, which is super critical. So again, thank you everybody for your participation. Jaime, I'm going to leave you the last word to wrap up the session. Jaime may have left. Okay, so I will wrap up the session. Thank you to all of our participants. We'll be putting everything online. We'll share this back with you, and we encourage everyone to kind of work with us in the bank and our partners around the world to create this future of education. Thank you very much. Have an awesome day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.